Hello, it's Philip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London, and today I'm looking at a book which has come to us from INTERSENTIA. And INTERSENTIA Publishing is based in Cambridge here in the UK and also in Belgium. This book is called Bauhaus Laws, The Modernist Revolution and Legal Thought, and it's been written by Daniel Damler. I think it's Damler actually. I do apologise if again I haven't quite pronounced the name correctly. Let's have a look at the book first of all. It's a small book, paperback. There it is there. It's not a big book at all. There's very little on the spine. You can probably just make something out. Then again, it's all inverted, so it's very difficult to read most of this stuff. As I say, it's a light book. It runs to about just 200 words. The details about Dr. Damler on the back. There is no index. It just runs through, and you can see there's actually some footnoting. If we go to the front of the book, we then get to the front page there, and this is a translated work. It says the translation of this work was funded by the Klaus and Simon Stiftung, or Stiftung is Federation in German. Now that is the detail for the book. Then there's some acknowledgements, and then we go from that to contents. So the contents section. There are only 5. I'll just read through them. It's actually described as pure Platonic modernism introduction. Vienna 1900. Utopias are built with new forms and materials. Hijacking modernism. One world beauty. Regaining sovereignty. And Kandinsky's laws as an epilogue. A bit heavy. However, I found it quite interesting. There is the beginning. It says Platonic Modernism Introduction. Let me read a bit to you. One thing they were agreed, the protagonists of Plato's dialogues, the Republic and Laws, that the weal and the woe of the community depended on the substance of childhood education, that the greatest care had to be taken to give the future elites of the ideal state a basic education in music and gymnastics, and that conversely the introduction of new musical compositions, dances and motoric skills had to be prevented at all costs. Then we go on and we get on to laws, and you see we are starting in the classical world and then we go on from there, and you can see the way the book goes. Lots of quite detailed footnotes, heavy, some interesting little pictures as well. I'm not taking the mickey too much. Then we get to chapter 1, Vienna, 1900, pure legal craftwork. This is looking at dear old Hans Kelsen of jurisprudence fame. Now, a lot of people do not like Kelsen. I do. Pure theory of law, wonderful. Mind you, I like jurisprudence. It's not for everyone because it's about politics and law and legal theory and philosophy. But there we go. That gives you an idea that in this book, which is actually quite easy to read, some nice little pictures again, it's an easy book to read and one I rather like because, like for instance, some of the jurisprudence works that I read for my degree. I love jurisprudence and I've taught it. These books are really quite important because they give you a really good additional foundation for the understanding of legal thought, which is of course part of what this is about. So Elizabeth, I thought, would be a good person to have a look at this book because I looked at it and thought, well, I'm enthusiastic. So what we'll do is we'll get Elizabeth to have a look at it from a slightly different point of view, which is great because she's come up, we had a long chat about the book, she's come up with what I thought was quite an interesting series of comments which she brought together for the review. So she's basically the lead writer. The title, Perspectives on Law, the Built Environment and the Visual Arts. Remember what I said about the introduction. You're getting an idea now about what the book is really about. So let me give you our view. Lawyers interested in art and architecture, especially architecture, including members of Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, will be intrigued by this book as it points up the affinities and interfaces between the visual arts and the law. But which of these influences the other? The author, Dr. Daniel Damler, makes some interesting suggestions by drawing certain parallels which suggest, for example, that the material vocabulary of objects generates new political and legal paradigms. Interesting point. By way of illustration, the book focuses on the Bauhaus School of Art and Design founded in 1919, 100 years ago. thus being the centenary year, of course. Interestingly, this slimline, lightweight volume, actually physically lightweight, but quite heavy in content in my view, contains a formidable amount of heavyweight scholarship and analysis across a wide range of subject matter, as Damler explores the connections that can be claimed to exist between developments in art and architecture, mainly in the 20th century, and the developments in the law. It's an interesting little parallel, if you like. It's published recently, as I say, by INTERSENTIA, and the book, says the author, is the fruit of many years of studying the influence of architecture and design, modernism, on legal and political thought. Now, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I think it's quite interesting to see the direction. As amongst his other credentials, this is Dr. Damler. He is an affiliate researcher at the Max Planck Institute for European Legal History in Frankfurt am Main. And he's identified any number of startling linkages which should provide considerable food for thought and debate in our view, while at the same time generating a curious sense of disquiet. Mind you, I have to say that that's been the problem with jurisprudence throughout the last 50 odd years. When you're trying to teach it, people get a little miffed sometimes because that pervading sense of disquiet is always there. I think it's probably because they get a bit worried about philosophy itself, and of course politics. Now, founded in Vienna, the Bauhaus Museum emitted an intellectual force which stressed the then relatively new aesthetic values of functionality, clarity, and ultimately transparency, in which elaborate ornamentation and even decoration had little or no place. And I can think of other countries where that was the case too. Germany. Love 'em or hate 'em, the names of Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe loom large in this book. Referring to transparency, of course, now thought to be a good thing in art, architecture and politics, the author points to George Orwell's 1984 as an illustration of how transparency can evolve into something sinister, something punitive, oppressive and completely mad. And of course the author notes that Orwell was influenced, who knew, by the now little known Russian author Yevgeny Samyatin, who wrote a dystopian novelette in 1921 entitled We. And we are the inhabitants of one state, all of whom are controlled by guardians, led by an all-powerful benefactor. Well, obviously hints of 1984, clearly. They live and work in a glass city, in which the built environment is constructed entirely of glass, including the streets and pavements. The novel, says Damler, plumbed the depths of the emerging constructive euphoria for transparency, manifested in the form of skyscrapers of steel and glass, and an interesting visual picture, if you like, of what he's talking about. Actually, I would go so far in a poetic sense to call it imagery. Now, the glass walls of one state enabled complete 24/7 surveillance of the workers by the guardians, what a surprise, except during the rare personal hours which allowed the docile inhabitants to lower the shades. It's a little bit like being in the condemned cell, really, if you think about it, where you've got someone watching you all the time. Apparently, after reviewing the book in 1946, good old George Orwell commenced writing 1984. Well, there's a surprise. Updating and replacing Samyatin's vision of total surveillance through glass with surveillance through cameras and telescreens, which the thought police could plug into at any time. You never knew quite when. Now, it's interesting to hear this because I've always been of the view, as a writer, like everybody else, that we do borrow other people's ideas and we change them and make them our own. Shakespeare was very notorious for that, and he's the greatest writer on earth that we've ever had, and you can understand, bearing in mind he borrowed from a lot of people, and other people do too, but it's what actually is the product of the borrowing which comes through, and that's the point that's being made here with Orwell, and the book actually identifies it. Now, Damler then theorises that Orwell's as well as Zamyatin's ghastly visions could well have become grim reality if Le Corbusier's 1935 urban development plans for a radiant city had eventually come to fruition. The details are enumerated in the text, which dwells on the great architect's perceived political motivations. I wonder what they were in reality. I'd like to ask him, we can't, unfortunately. His concepts for this monolithic urban utopia, built on 3 levels, contained no explicit reference to the law and legislation. No yearnings for democratic processes here, then. You can see what the problem is. Let me conclude by saying this, that with such examples, including that of the famed Bauhaus exponent Kandinsky at the back of the book, who initially trained to be a lawyer, you'd be interested to know, does this author illustrate, quote, the ramifications of legal and political thinking caused by the material world? Now, using a multidisciplinary approach, we say he has constructed a largely convincing thesis supported by careful research, as indicated by the extensive footnoting. And this is a learned work. Artists and writers, as well as academics and politicians, and yes, lawyers, and maybe town planners too, will almost certainly regard this book as an illuminating, if controversial, read. And I certainly did. It's not a difficult book to read, and it makes you think, and I think that's probably the whole purpose and success of it. So I'd like to thank Dr. Damler very much for it. The date of publication of the paperback is cited as at the 3rd of June 2019. Here's the book again, little paperback, there we go, the back of it there, can't read too much. I haven't mentioned all the people mentioned in this, but let's have a look. Hijacking Modernism, here we go. That's the sort of work you've got. You've got the basic text, then a bit of footnoting. The key to reading this work, because it's not a big book, is to read it straight through. And then when you get to the end, you end up with, of course, the epilogue, Kandinsky's Laws, right at the back. It's an interesting book. And can I say, having actually travelled later in life, having actually lived for a time in Germany, but having travelled on the continent much later, and because I didn't have student years the way normal people do. I just left school at 16 and then studied and got the qualifications by part-time learning. But when I did go to some of these foreign cities, a lot of the little bits of the jigsaw puzzle fit in. That's why I thought the book was so interesting. But I'm an enthusiastic jurisprudent. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Tom Shears very much for sending this book to us, and of course to Dr. Damler for a most interesting work. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.